Hi everyone, I hope you're well. Let's get started with colonized and racialized bodies. What is race? So DeMello starts out by saying, essentially, we have misunderstood what race is for several centuries now, and that profound misunderstanding is still affecting our situation today. So let's have a look. What she says is that we look at each other and we think, well, I can see a difference. I can see that someone looks different to me, and that therefore I confirm the fact that that race exists because I feel that I can see it. And she says we imagine that it's sort of like different breeds of dogs, right? There's like this dog and it's bred separately from this one, and they have different characteristics. But she says, in fact, that is not true at all. It's not the case. She says, while we may look different from each other, those differences do not translate into subgroups of humans the way that we think they do, the way that we think of races. All they are is, she says, they are simply superficial physical differences. So superficial in both senses, meaning it just doesn't go, it's meaningless, but also it doesn't go very deep. It doesn't like we attach meaning to these differences that is not there by itself. So why do we look different if there's no, if race is not a subgrouping of humans? Why does it appear to be some kind of difference? And she says that basically, let me see. Races are artificial categories of people that are distinguished from each other on the basis of arbitrary criteria. Arbitrary means random. It means without reason. And she says, like skin color or eye shape. So the fact that we have latched on to skin color as some kind of meaningful unit or meaningful trait is itself a misunderstanding, because skin is no more important than eye color, eye shape, hair color, things like that. It's just a difference. And she says, but what happens is that she says the groups are then ranked in a graded hierarchy. Those at the top of the hierarchy are the Western countries, so sort of the Northern European countries. This is where this all began, by the way, which I'll get to, is in those Northern European countries where there's very little sunlight and therefore very little melanin in the skin cells. I will get to that part. Those at the top of the hierarchy in Western countries, that would be people of Northern European descent, are then, so here's why it matters, right? They are then granted more privileges and opportunities than those who are on this lower, whom they have put on a lower rung of the ladder of the hierarchy. And so she says, race is a social, economic, and political system of division and inequality, right? Division, because it says these are all separate categories of people, and inequality because when race was invented, it was invented in order to rank people. So in that sense, it is by its nature divisive or about division, and it is by its nature about inequality, right? Because it says this is a ranking system. Okay, so what am I talking about? This ranking system? Where did it come from? Well, it came from colonialism, basically. The biggest colonizer was Britain, Great Britain, for a long, long time. And there was also a French Empire, and there were, German colonizers, and so on. But people from Northern Europe were the ones who engaged in this, and it's a behavior where you go to different parts of the world, and you take lumber, and you take rubber, and you take all kinds of things from under the ground. So oil, diamonds, gold, and also probably also people for the slave trade. So this is where it begins. But if you go to someone's home and you sort of start taking everything, and you maybe slaughter people in the process of doing these things, then you are going to feel that you're doing something wrong. And in order to live with that kind of thing, these people would tell a story to themselves about why what they were doing was actually a good idea. And that story is basically that God or whomever created a tiny group of people from the north of Europe who were destined to rule the rest of the world because they were superior, right? So they developed this narrative, and they turn it into reality, or what they think is reality, by giving it kind of a scientific, grounding, right? So let me see. So there are people in, England, but also there's a particular Swedish guy. My thing is not loading. Called Linnaeus. You may have heard of Linnaeus because Linnaeus is the one who. Let me see. Here we go. Linnaeus is credited with creating the taxonomic system used to scientifically catalog plants and animals today, right? So he kind of was one of the inventors of having these kinds of systems of classification and classifying, genus and species, and naming all of these plants and seeds. And there was kind of almost a mania for classifying things, and then of course classifying people who were newly quote unquote discovered by the Europeans. So let's see. So Linnaeus comes up with this idea that there are 5 biological races, and they each have their own physical and intellectual characteristics. Right, so that's Linnaeus. And then a Frenchman, it's a French name, Cuvier, says that there are 3 races, and so on. So you basically have groups of scientists who are saying, because Linnaeus and Cuvier place Europeans at the top of this scientific racial hierarchy. So basically, they create a system, they put themselves at the very top because, as you do, right? And they said, okay, so everybody else underneath of us is lesser. So all of the other scientists throughout the 19th century agreed with these early thinkers, and all saw Europeans, so Northern Europeans, as being biologically superior. And in the United States, there was a debate about which people were more inferior than the others. So obviously, again, the Europeans put Europeans at the top, and then they said, are Native Americans or are African Americans more inferior, right? This was not, they weren't questioning the idea of race. They weren't questioning the idea of a hierarchy. They were questioning, where should we put people on the rung because everyone else is below us, right? And this is called a pseudoscience because we now know that it was follow any kind of true scientific process. And then so she goes through and she talks about all of these pseudo-scientific practices that people like Linnaeus and Cuvier and many people who came after them used to kind of prove to themselves that Europeans were the best and the highest. There's one called physiognomy, where they would measure the skull shape, and they would measure the distance of the jawline and the forehead, and they would kind of create all this data that said, it seemed very scientific, very mathematical, to suggest that, again, Europeans at the top, everyone else at the bottom. And then, yeah. So you can see how that kind of mentality would easily lead to things like enslavement. These people are not as good as Europeans, and they would even, this narrative that they developed, even went so far as to say these people don't actually feel any pain. They are not really human in that respect. She does a big section about how non-white bodies are actually compared at the time, and you can see the relationship between what Linnaeus was doing and animals, because he was also classifying animals, classifying humans along with animals. She has a long section about how non-white bodies are treated in the same way as animals are treated. So let's see. People of color have been compared to animals since at least colonialism, and certainly since the African slave trade emerged in the 17th century. So there's also a need to kind of justify the slave trade. Ultimately, the slave trade is ended in the 1800s, early 1800s, but she points out in the last chapter about commodified bodies that once Americans in the South, slave owners, plantation owners, can no longer buy more slaves, because the slave trade is outlawed, they have an incentive then to have their own slaves create additional slaves, because any offspring of one's slave then becomes the property again of the owner. So she talks about it in the sense of slave owners impregnating slave women and having really, really, as I say, an incentive to do this, to create more and more slaves, either to then sell off those slaves or to, create more property for themselves. And then she says this discourse, this kind of narrative, this talking, this thinking, this feeling, this acting, is in fact very close to how animals were treated. So, Blacks were thought to not feel pain. They were thought to not feel love towards their children, because you cannot really take someone's child from them and either sell the child as a slave or enslave the child without having some kind of narrative that you tell yourself, right? So they would say, oh, they don't love their children in the same way, or they don't feel pain. They were thought to be happier under slavery than living on their own. My slaves are happy. I can tell because of how they behave. This is another part of this narrative. In addition, slavery was an important part of the economy of the American South. And so there again, you can see why this need, right, why this need to justify the degradation of a people based on, again, a very arbitrary physical trait. So all the way back, okay, so England starts us off, actually Portugal starts us off, but that's another story. Starts us off with colonizing areas and then trying to justify colonization by saying, well, these people need our help, or these people are like children, or these people are just lesser, they're inferior. So we can kind of do what we want to with them. So it starts out as colonialism, then it becomes the slave trade. Then, of course, we have slavery here. And because of that whole legacy of the idea, I mean, DeMello says people still kind of hold on to this idea that there is a hierarchy and that some people are higher than others on this racial hierarchy, instead of seeing how it actually is, which is just random characteristics of different peoples. So she says, we look different because our ancestors grew up in, or evolved rather, in different environmental conditions. So Northern Europeans did not have very much sunlight, and therefore they did not develop as much melanin in their skin cells, right? Other people who were in areas with a lot of sunlight developed more melanin in their skin cells because it protects against UV radiation, right? So it's just a response to the environment. So it's genes, but also in response to the environment. That is all it means. So, so she's saying, because of this amount of melanin in cells, this whole universe of division and inequality has happened. But in fact, the cells have nothing to do with anything until you kind of get into this kind of interested colonial mindset, or scientific mindset, or pseudoscientific mindset, or mindset that justifies the slave trade. And then I will let you read this for yourself. She talks about how this kind of thinking leads to eugenics and forced sterilization, which actually she mentions in an earlier chapter, of undesirable, quote unquote, undesirable people, inferior races. And then this moves right into to Hitler and the idea that Hitler's obsession that somehow the Jews were inferior, that they were going to contaminate the Germans who were superior, and that they had to be eradicated, right? They had to be run out. They had to be finally exterminated, right? It's all of a piece. It's all the same kind of narrative, comes from the same ideas, right? So they talk about eugenics in the United States and then in Europe, and we know where that leads. And then sort of the animalization of non-white bodies, and last couple of things. She says, where is it? Oh, that people in this 19th century classifying mania that was considered scientific, they would do things like, who was it? Samuel Morton decided that he was going to prove the superiority of Europeans by using skulls. And he called it craniometry, right? And so what he would do was he gathered tons and tons of skulls of Native Americans and African Americans and European Americans, and he did some kind of measurement to prove his theory, right? But then DeMello says, so what has happened is there are natural history museums that have huge collections because of this type of thing, of people's bones, people's ancestors' bones and skulls and artifacts. And she says, one result of Morton's work and the work of others like him, right, was that American natural history museums were at one time full of the skulls, bones, and artifacts of Native Americans. So imagine if your grandparents, their bones were scattered around and in museums somewhere. It was perfectly, in fact, at one time it was perfectly legal to dig up Native American graves and use the bones and other items found therein for scientific purposes or display. It was not until the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which passed in 1990, that Native American bones were finally given back to Native Americans, and that grave looting of this type was prohibited. But, and again, as I tied Corpus Christi into the last video, I want to mention, because I find it quite chilling, that in Corpus Christi, when they were building Ennis Jocelyn, so those of you who are on campus or have been on campus or drive to campus, you drive on Ennis Jocelyn, and that road was actually built on top of a massive Native American grave site where they did not exhume the remains and repatriate them. They were supposed to do this, but they did not do this. So literally every time we drive down Ennis Jocelyn, we are driving over the bodies or the bones of the Native American peoples who lived here before us. So even though there are these kinds of laws to try to be more sensitive and to try to eradicate racism, it's still, these things still go on. So read about Trayvon Martin. The shooting of Trayvon Martin echoes throughout what is happening now. So read that part. And then the human zoos. This again, a number of you expressed, discussed about things like freak shows in the last chapter. And this went on with different races too. The colonial world fairs. They would have people who were representatives of these cultures that they considered inferior, and they would make zoos, human zoos, and people would come and look at the people that we've colonized and that we are helping, right? So read those sections, and I think that is, let me say one more thing. It's kind of nice. It's a simple line that she makes, but it's quite nice. But just because our ancestors passed on traits to us that make us look different from each other does not mean that we can be broken into subgroups on the basis of those differences. And more importantly, just because we look different from each other does not mean that we are different. Just because we look different doesn't mean that we are different. There is simply no connection between external physical traits and other characteristics. However, yeah, I'm just going to let you read it. Read the rest. Okay, everyone, that's enough for now.